This was it. This was NBC's chance to save The Office, to make a new first impression, to seal the deal and solidify everybody's fears about a post-Michael Office. So how did they do? All right, so let's talk about the inner circle today, the fan reception, a deeper meaning, which feels like a reboot of sorts for the show. And I'm going to share my thoughts on what I think works here and what doesn't. And spoiler, if you've watched my last 3 or 4 episodes, you might be a little surprised. So let's go.
I understand nothing.
We open up with a conference room meeting, and D'Angelo is setting a very aggressive tone for his occupation. And this is a clever bit. The Office and Parks and Recreation to a much larger degree would often show how doing something good for people from a leadership standpoint often results in unanticipated blowback. Think about your cake parties or your raises. Here we're kind of seeing an interesting balance of aggressive, fear-inducing tone, but all the news is good, and it's leaving everyone a little bit confused. D'Angelo's talking head explains the reasoning.
Once they figure me out, they start to tell me what I want to hear. And I need to quickly figure out who's a good worker and who is a good mind reader.
This is our first look at what Will Ferrell could bring to The Office, and just being honest, this ain't bad. It's a nuanced take on the Michael Scott role, but that very sentence is what doomed this episode. Even Angela can't help but compare the two.
Michael.
And while the DVD and streaming cuts of this episode have a lot of edited out content, it's pretty clear that everyone is calibrating their work personas with D'Angelo, and we're going to see that throughout this episode. Thinking that Kevin has D'Angelo pinned, we then head into the opening credits. We do have a few noticeable changes. Rainn Wilson is now top billed, and the Michael Scott Dundee shot is replaced with a similar D'Angelo-centric moment, something that the series would play with for the next several episodes. And it's not very clear how much time has passed between this episode and Goodbye Michael, but some culture has already been established around the office. D'Angelo has become chummy with a small group of staff members, which the outsiders have begun to call the inner circle.
There is no inner circle.
Your boy, Kevin Malone, is in the inner circle.
Kevin's talking head there is executed extremely well. In fact, there are several talking heads in this episode that I think are exceptionally well done. For example,
Quirky 10th grader Becky Walters finds a wounded Pegasus in the woods, and she becomes the horse flyer.
It's just a shame that Jenna Fisher seems to have a cold or something during this episode.
Eggs and bowling balls.
She feels a little bit out of it, but the character is feeling the impacts of being on the outside, a place she has yet to find herself throughout this entire series. Pam was always beloved by Michael, sometimes too much, but now she's probably reliving those days in her mind in which her boss was so desperate to include her in things, he'd do things like this.
Oh, almost dropped you.
Can you put me down? I'm getting a little nauseous.
This puts the main source of drama in play for the inner circle, which is the outer circle versus D'Angelo, and to a much lesser degree, the inner circle. The inner circle consists of Daryl, Jim, Kevin, and Gabe. A B-plot does run the length of this episode in which Vickers is trying to win over Dwight, but it's much ado about nothing other than leading to a very fun fact we learn about Dwight.
Okay, a little about me. I respond to strong leadership.
Something that never gets brought up ever again. But while the day progresses, the inner circle is called on to assist D'Angelo in the hiring of a new admin, which sets up the now infamous scene in which D'Angelo mimes out a juggling routine. I'll forever be convinced that all of this was improvised on the fly by Will Ferrell, as it seems just very much in his wheelhouse. If you've ever seen a motivational juggler, by the way, I think you'll know what he was going for here. I'm pretty sure he nailed it. I especially love his closing statement.
Thank you so much. Hope you learned something.
As in, what was the lesson here? There really wasn't anything of substance. But actually, I think there's a reason for this sequence, and we're going to get to that in a deeper meaning. Everyone's reaction to Vickers during this just seals in how the character feels about him and what's happening. There's confusion, there's fake enthusiasm, and without a single line in this episode, we know exactly where Stanley is now. And then there's Creed. I'm not sure what he's seeing. As the day goes on, the Outers begin to share their sentiments about D'Angelo.
I like working for him.
Of course you do, Jim. You're a man. D'Angelo is a huge sexist.
Which harkens back to the conversation we had way back in season 3 when The Office dealt with this back then.
What you're saying is extremely misogynistic.
But we're going to get to that later in this video. For now, the inners and the outers are all coping with their place in the unofficial hierarchy of The Office. After Jim confronts D'Angelo in a cringeworthy fashion, by the way.
You are a little sexist, or...
Damn!
Whoa.
What is wrong with you? Why did you have to phrase it like that?
An out-of-touch D'Angelo attempts to rectify his inter-office relations and reinforce his appreciation for women while introducing his new admin. During this sequence, we see maybe Phyllis took Michael's words to heart, which is kind of touching. After this sequence, though, it's clear that for his speaking up, Jim has now been ejected out of the inner circle. Andy, who somewhat plays on commentary for the extreme male feminist role, immediately throws his values aside once the opportunity arises to advance his position with the new boss. And with the boys club getting too rowdy, Pam attempts to fulfill her office admin duty to keep the office working.
Thanks, Mom.
However, in the process, Jim is able to bait D'Angelo in the same way that Charles Minor baited him all of those years ago. Being a short dude with barely any vertical leap, I couldn't even dream of touching the net of a regulation basketball hoop. But I have to imagine in this situation, aggressive self-rescue is all that would be going through my mind. I do love that D'Angelo didn't have his juggling set, by the way, but he did have these super long basketball shorts with him. And at this point, if seeing D'Angelo carted out in an ambulance wasn't enough for the audience to know that he wasn't coming back, D'Angelo does come back to the office for one more nonsensical bit.
The
more I analyzed the sequence, the more I noticed. Things like Angela saying,
Michael.
And then the next cut, you can see her breaking character. And as they're all walking D'Angelo out of the office for good, Krasinski also breaks. It's almost as though the nerves and the walls were gone at this point in the filming, and everyone was loosening up, having some fun, and making a pretty funny scene. But that might lend into how this episode turned out overall. We're going to get to that in the ratings, but I have a solid respect for the writer tasked to write The Inner Circle, Charles Grandy. It was no easy task to devise the major plot elements for the first Carell-less episode of The Office. Getting to play with a new set of rules but not swaying too far from the sidewalk would also have definitely been a monumental task. And tackling the toxic workplace culture was an interesting take that was truly unique to this episode in one major way. Though The Office handled sexism way back in Season 2 and Season 3, the thing is they couldn't show Michael Scott really being a dick, only kind of a dick.
I don't know that I believe anyone's 100% a dick, man.
And that's because Michael was a reluctant villain. Showing truly despicable behavior would have acted in a way to truly vilify the character, and thus lose the audience's affection for him. With D'Angelo, though, this being his last appearance and all, they didn't quite have that problem. They could make us hate the character, and they worked that in some clever and nuanced ways. So let's take a look at that and this episode's commentary on inter-office politics as we dive into the deeper meaning.
What does a bean mean?
Someone please explain it to Cap.
Like I said, this is the one time The Office could actually make us hate the person residing in the manager's seat, and we have all sorts of reasons to do so. First, let's deal with the blatant sexism in this episode.
Which doesn't exist.
Right, except it 100% does exist. Depending on how you define sexism, at least, because it could also be called misogyny. Now, I can hear the keyboard warriors typing frivolously already. Well, before you panic too much, I'm not making a political stance here. I'm not. Not yet, at least. I'm going to take a look at what this episode is saying, though. And The Office very much is, as it has done several times throughout its run, commenting on a dysfunctional workplace, which is basically the reason the series existed in the first place. So before the Alpha Bros peace out, hear me as a fellow fan of The Office, and let's dig in. The lunch calibration session is when this episode specifically calls out D'Angelo's sexism. They identify the inner circle is a boys' club under the guise of departmental jam sessions. While Jim technically is the head of sales, Kevin is replacing Angela, Pam is not invited, and then, that's right, Jordan later sits in to take notes, something typically reserved for the receptionist to do. but we're going to get into that in just a moment. For now, I'm just calling out that Aaron was also not invited to these sessions. Beyond the males-only inner circle are the differences in the ways that D'Angelo talks with his employees. For example, he's desperately trying to win over Dwight with gifts, boast, and whatever this was actually intended to be.
Tell your whore to leave me alone.
Nevertheless, Dwight very much is a target for D'Angelo to win over, at least in his eyes. He's also super chummy with Ryan. None of this alone is poor behavior, by the way. But let's take a quick look at how he treats the women when he's having one-on-one conversations with them. Right, because he doesn't have any direct one-to-one conversations with women in this episode, except when Pam, the puppy dog, interrupts him at the door. He has this warmth when he's talking with Daryl, that turns cold when dealing with Pam, then immediately flips when he addresses, you guessed it,
Hey, dudes.
Hey.
Admittedly, Pam is written very hyper here, but it probably has something to do with the fact that Michael loved her so much that he named his dog after her.
He just named his new puppy after you.
Pamela Beagsley. It's a beagle. It's really f***ing cute.
But with D'Angelo, she can't find an in, meaning that she's feeling her career is out of control, and that makes her behave a bit erratic.
Erratic?
Which has more to do with inner office politics, but that doesn't seem to help that she can't find that in, seemingly because she's a woman. Looking at the Inner Circle's resume session, I particularly love Gabe's word choice here.
300 square feet, 320?
320. Just free ball in it.
While that figure of speech can mean improvising without sufficient preparation, it also just means not wearing any underwear. Language that corporate Gabe would probably choose safer alternatives for in a mixed gendered situation. But here, with just the dudes, he feels free to speak freely. It's only a problem when the Inner Circle becomes an exclusive club because their behavior would have to change, meaning that they would never change because this is where it's comfortable. As they all joke about unqualified applicants, mainly jokes about qualifications and the intelligence level of the women who applied, a solo man is pulled from the pile, spurring the infamous juggling scene, but for a moment, think through the ramifications here. The only dude seeming to have made the short list of resumes was someone that D'Angelo had an inherent bias towards.
I'm a big juggler.
Further, let's talk about this for a second. Why does he need an admin in the first place? On one hand, it's probably a joke commenting on the very real workplace thing that happens, in which when new management takes over, they tend to bring in a bunch of their own ideals, their own people, spend a butt ton of money that's unnecessary under the guise of correcting course. And once all that dust settles, people get let go, and it's very much a power play. And don't forget that in the cold opening, he only directly benefited the guys in the office, perhaps even queuing up some loyalty from the HR department over a chair that Michael probably broke for the proposal.
Toby, you're getting a new chair.
Thanks.
So with Toby paid off, it left only Jim to confront D'Angelo, and what has to be the highest moment of cringe for me in this episode. I mean, seriously, there's a time and place for everything, and I can see the merits in just coming out and saying it, but, you know, you gotta own it then, Jim. Not speaking meekly under the guise of conveying other people's concerns. This conflicts with every way that I would handle this situation, and it creates a fantastic moment for me. And the boys club responds exactly like these cliques do when someone breaks rank.
Damn!
Whoa. Wait.
With retaliation. First, we have D'Angelo's defense, which comes in two parts. And in case someone is misinterpreting the joke here, saying I love women is not the same as saying I'm not a sexist. We dealt with that again in season 3. This is backed up by what immediately follows, introducing a brand new admin, an attractive yet inexperienced young woman, signifying that her appearance was probably more of a selling point than what she would really bring to the role, work-wise. So how can someone like D'Angelo say and probably genuinely believe that he loves women, and yet his behavior says that he's sexist? Well, fear not, that's also in the subtext of this episode, and it's an inherent bias that he seems to have against women in general. For example, the C plot of this one is Ryan pretending to be Kelly's boss. Well, early in the episode, Ryan is seen yelling at Kelly. D'Angelo's response would indicate that he has an implicit trust for what Ryan's doing at that moment, that he's doing the right thing by taking a harsh tone towards a subordinate. He laughs it off. But then later, Kelly finally tells D'Angelo the truth.
You seem kind of hysterical to me.
Kelly is kind of hysterical. It's pretty much a character trait of hers. This was just 10 minutes ago.
How did you even get that job?
Well,
You chose this job over that job?
Okay, back to work, Kelly.
But Kelly presented the truth to D'Angelo in a relatively calm demeanor. While shocking, she was very much not hysterical. D'Angelo still sides with Brian, again showing an implicit trust towards the man, and uses language that very much seems to have its roots in historical sexism. Language is fluid and, we use words in a plethora of ways. I'm convinced this word choice was very specifically chosen here by the writers to make it completely clear that D'Angelo is judging this with an inherent bias towards women. And if you still don't believe me, then there's this.
Some of the female department heads.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Right? Hot.
And look, The Office isn't just playing the part of the woke social justice warrior commentary, and sometimes it's even commenting on the opposite. But it very much is calling out what happens when those in charge are offering opportunities to just a single demographic, in this case, the men in the office. Because if you're following along here, beyond the sexism, there absolutely is a deeper theme at play, and it's that sweet, sweet inner office politics. Everyone is dealing with how to bridge the gap between their work personas and their career aspirations, reflected by their desire to be in the inner circle versus wanting to destroy the inner circle. Some people are unintentionally behaving weirdly, like Pam. Some people are masking their personal feelings and their personality, sacrificing their own values in the process, like Daryl.
Damn, man, respect from a brother.
And more poignantly, Andy later. Now, this strategy, while maybe related to what he says in the cold opening, is probably a result of just being a bad leader, which is what I think the whole point of the faux juggling scene was meant to convey from a writing standpoint, that all that's glitter is not gold. D'Angelo does everything he can to put on a front of a big show, but underneath, there's nothing. By the way, he's already told us as much in the sequence that I can't pay enough to stay in my head for some reason.
Walking along, out of work, again.
Give me that damn dog, you thief!
Bad leadership is when the inner office politics go from fun to terrible, for me at least. I love this stuff. I love figuring out how to manage up, analyzing the workplace relationships that I see around me, how people advance their careers. All of that stuff is so much fun to me. But when you have a bad leader, the rules of engagement are out the door because poor behavior is often rewarded. And speaking the truth, even if it's done cringefully so, is looked down upon.
Damn!
Retaliation, sexism, inconsistency, and the punishment mindset are all marks of bad leadership. And speaking of inconsistency, Jim is offered his spot back here in the inner circle. It's at this point our boy has to decide if his career should take precedence over his decency, which is a concept that I am obsessed with over the last year or so. Where does someone's decency meet their worldview? In this case, Jim turns down the offer to rejoin the boys club, opting to try to knock D'Angelo down a notch. I doubt hospitalization and ruining someone's life was, in Jim's head here, but it was more of an attempt to disillusion the boys club over their leader, which again is the office's commentary on ineffective virtual signaling. Andy was never going to change anything here because the moment he got behind closed doors, he just reverts to frat boy. And he really only cared more about advancing himself in his social groups and then later in his career, more than actually acting in a way that would result in change.
Snip, snip. Am I right, girls?
So in this, Jim is once again shown to be the hero of the day. Thing is, just knowing people and having been in the workplace now for so long, had this accident not happened, this wouldn't have worked at all. The staff would have been stuck with another season 1 Michael Scott scenario with a dysfunctional, immature, and sexist boss. However, that's not what The Office is anymore. So the fanciful exit of Will Ferrell from the season occurred with spectacular fashion, and we're left saying,
now what?
And so let's talk about that in the ratings.
This is the worst!
Right, so out of the gate with no Steve Carell, we have an episode that is, in my opinion, absolutely on par with the rest of the writing, tone, and approach of the show over the last year, especially season 6's content before they were having to deal with Carell's departure. The jokes are written at a similar cadence, the characters inch forward in various ways, and the episode ends in a way that you feel satisfied for watching it, without much substantially actually happening. All of this is comedy episode writing 101. It worked very well in season 6, and yet now without Steve Carell, the rating suffered massively. Taking a look at the scores for this, it's rated quite low, but upon looking at those reviews, for the most part, it seems to be people bemoaning Carell's absence, almost taking all of their angst out on this episode simply because it's the first, or people not quite understanding the point of Will Ferrell's inclusion, something that I've already talked about at length. What's weird is that I actually think the writing and Ferrell's performance work quite well for this situation. We've all had new bosses, and while things always start cordially, over time we begin to see the cracks in their character. If you've not been in the workplace and had this experience yourself, then think about a professor or even just a teacher that you initially loved, but over time you began to become slowly defensive towards the person in order to prevent yourself from experiencing any of their anger, their retribution, or wrath. And that was really a smart play for Grandy in this situation. Like I talked about, the decision to make Will Ferrell an objectively bad manager, not just a weird or zany manager, just a bad person, created a playground that they'd never really be able to play with ever again throughout this series. Which is why I say this feels like a reboot of the deeper meaning aspect of The Office in some ways. They'd swung so hard into the dramatic territories that the show is a far cry from being a piece of comedy commentary on the white-collar versus blue-collar relationships, or the performance reviews, or just what it's like to have a bad boss. Having a reminder like this that a bad manager can in fact ruin the place that we spend a majority of our time at while we are awake, that is what The Office is. And this slow descent into madness began with the whole cake thing from last episode, although in fairness, D'Angelo's prior addiction had little to no bearing on anything that happened in the series. Beyond the writing with no Carell for Will to play second fiddle to, it gave him a chance to create a neat, nuanced, fanciful villain. He's not pure evil, he's just kind of a dick. He doesn't think of himself as a sexist, but he clearly is. He doesn't see a problem with the inner circle model, yet in practice this would result in disillusioning good workers and thus losing them. Further, it also seems that the actors began to loosen up and really got into a groove with the new temporary lead. It seems that the mini breaks that we see in character in the final moments of this episode, it's clear that there was some comedic cohesion occurring. It's a shame that happened in what I'm assuming was probably one of the last scenes shot for this episode. So I don't actually hate the Inner Circle episode of The Office. It's packed with everything I love from this series, minus one of my favorite sources of jokes and drama. It suffers a bit due to that, but not significantly. I don't hate this. I just hate the decisions that led to the misuse of Will Ferrell. But I have to ask myself, did they actually capitalize on this one chance to make a new first impression with fans? Admittedly, I think a lot of fans were already checking out at this point during the series, and those who stayed were curious on how this transition would be handled. So it's kind of hard for me to say, but I could see what they were trying to do. And while it's not what I would have done, I've also never received an offer letter to go write for a major production like The Office. But hey, just hit me up on my email, No. I'll ask you this. Was the Inner Circle truly that bad? Was it the misstep that broke The Office for good? For me, probably not. While I've criticized a lot of The Office's writing as of late, this is very much on par. In my opinion, this episode gets the brunt of the fandom's hatred, and that's why it's listed so low. All up, I give the Inner Circle 3 out of 5.
Oh, I think it's 18 hundo.
But that's just what I think about the Inner Circle episode of The Office. What are your thoughts? Leave them in the comments and let me know. Next week, we're going to be talking about Dwight Schrute, acting manager, which made my short list of the best Carellus episodes of The Office. So we're in for a real treat. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.